Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Marion Coleman, and I am an attorney and a partner at Soliz Coleman PLLC. This is the new law firm that is being spun up by my law partner Cynthia Solis and myself. And one of the things that we are dedicated towards doing is helping the LGBT community as rapid changes in the law happen. And if you have been paying attention at all, you'll be aware that those rapid changes are happening very quickly with the start of the new administration. So the purpose of this meeting today is to go through the anti-trans executive orders published by President Trump since his inauguration on January 20th. There are now 5 executive orders. Unfortunately, we're going to have to go through them fairly quickly. Due to limited time. But if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will try and address them at the end. Okay, so without further ado, a little bit about me. I've been practicing law since 2013. I had got my JD from the University of Texas School of Law here in Austin, and I have represented school districts across the state of Texas, large districts, small districts, 100 students, 100,000 students. After that, I did some family law, some CPS and mediation, and some LGBTQ advocacy before going in-house counsel at Austin ISD, and I did that for about a year. But I left there, and now I'm partner here at Soliz Coleman PLLC, and we're bringing this to you free of charge. We're doing this sort of as a public service because we think that people need to know about these, and they need to be empowered to fight against them going forward. Okay, so first off, really quick, what is an executive order? If you know, then you can tune out for a second. But if you don't know, here's what you need to know. It's a written directive by the president. It instructs the federal government to do something or to not do something specific. And in theory, it's enabled by Article 2 of the Constitution, and that says that the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So in theory, an executive order is something that is empowered to make sure that the federal government is executing laws faithfully. And it's binding on the executive branch, but it's not binding on the courts necessarily, and it's not binding on Congress especially. But an executive order is not a law. A law must be passed by Congress, the U.S. Senate and the House, and then it has to be signed by the president. It's also not a regulation. Regulation are rules adopted by a federal agency that must follow the APA, or the Administrative Procedures Act, to be created or amended. You may be aware, President Biden went through the process to create a number of regulations that are protective of transgender rights. Some of those were halted in the court, some of those were frozen, but those just don't disappear overnight, just even though there is a executive order. What we do have, though, is a directive for the federal government to create new federal regulations, and we have, in some instances, directives to federal agencies to work with Congress to create new laws. So for 2025, we've got the following executive orders so far. 4 of these were day 1, so they were all published on January 20th, and the 5th one was published on February 5th, so just 2 days ago. And once I had this finished, I had to go back and I had to add that to it. Really quickly, there's defending women from gender ideology and extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. That one is, if you're only going to read one in full, that's the one to go read in full, because that is the one that informs all the other orders. Second, prioritizing military excellence and readiness. You wouldn't necessarily think that that is an anti-trans order, but it absolutely is. Third is protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. Again, that's targeting transgender minor care. Ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schooling. That's not limited to transgender issues, but it absolutely includes them. And then finally, the most recent one is keeping men out of women's sports. So what we're going to see throughout these, as we go through them in some detail, you're going to see that there's a number of areas of attack. First off, they are creating moral judgments about what it means to be transgender. And you're going to see morally charged language through these orders again and again and again. They're making an absolute moral judgment about what it means to be trans. They're also making scientific judgments. They're saying some science is good, other science is bad. highly questionable statements there regarding scientific judgment. They're affecting funding standards everywhere. Any place that has any sort of federal dollars involved, they're going after that funding if there's an LGBT or gender identity component to their teachings, or even their support materials. They're going after insurance. Right now, it's primarily after federal employee insurance and military employee insurance. But believe me, they're going to be going after all levels of insurance, private and public, because they've already indicated that they're going after the Affordable Care Act. Employee rights. This is definitely an area that's going to be highly affected. Federal employees are the obvious first target. But when you are an employee of any entity and you go to the government to say, I was discriminated against, the federal government is not going to have your side if you are saying that you were discriminated against because you are transgender. So that is being pulled back. Sports, obviously, one of them is directly affecting sports. Any federal guidance that's being issued, and that is extremely broad, and we'll talk about some of the areas where that's affected. Federal regulations, obviously, same thing, but we're talking across the board with federal regulations. Any federal agency that you can think of that has any kind of reference to transgender individuals, they're being asked or being told rather to pull those back. K through 12 programming is being directly addressed. Crucially for a lot of folks, identification documentation. And we'll talk about that more in detail in a little bit. Incarcerated individuals, so individuals who are transgender who are in prisons, they're being told that they need to be transferred to prisons that align with their sex at birth. This has already been halted in a couple of states. We'll talk about that as well. And not content with handling it domestically, there are portions of these order that talk about how the United States is going to be trying to apply these internationally, especially when it comes to sports. So we've got Ralph Wiggum here. Haha, I'm in danger. If you've got transgender friends and family, this is what they're thinking. I know because it's what I'm thinking. Okay, so first order, defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. So one of the things that's always has to be in an executive order is the citation to authority. Of all 5 of these, defending women is the only one that has a specific citation to a specific statute. And it cites to 7301 of Title V of the United States Code. Well, okay, so maybe there's some sort of legal authority here. Really, it's all the same. President may prescribe regulations for the conduct of employees of the executive branch. As we will see, however, this goes way beyond that. I do have in here links to the Ballotpedia versions of the federal orders. The reason I'm going to be citing to Ballotpedia instead of the White House or the Federal Register is this agency or the current administration is systematically going through and changing what is available, how it's available, and they're erasing various things from the internet, from their parts of the internet. So best practice at the moment is to cite to non-federal government resources. The purpose, the self-stated purpose of the Defending Women Executive Order is to base federal policy on truth because it's critical to scientific inquiry, public safety, morale, and trust in government itself, which is, it's rich. And validating the true and biological category of woman and properly transforms in law policies designed to protect sex-based opportunities into laws and policies that undermine them, replacing long-standing, cherished legal rights and values with an identity-based, inchoate social concept. So here we've already got moral and scientific statements being made. They're saying that there is one version of science that is accurate, and we are reflecting that accurate version of science. And they're saying that the idea of creating this inchoate social concept inherently takes away rights of women, according to them. Uh, this is where the defending women goes into detail and becomes extremely problematic. You can read the definitions for yourself. I encourage you to do so, but the short version is they're defining sex to exclude any kind of gender identity concepts. They're saying sex is based on production of reproductive cells at birth. They define gender ideology as any belief or assertion that sex is and gender are separate, or that gender identity is real in any sense. They're basically trying to erase the concept that there's any validity to gender identity as a separate concept. They define male and man as an individual who at birth produces the small reproductive cell, female and woman as at birth who produces the large reproductive cell. They define these as immutable and unchangeable. Finally, they define gender identity as being internal and subjective. It does not affect sex, and they literally say that gender identity creates an infinite continuum. And by that definition, it cannot be the basis for identification. That tees up what we're going to see a little bit later. So what are the directives in this defending women EO? Since we know that every executive order has to be telling somebody to do something, well, it creates these definitions and it says, federal agencies, you follow these definitions. So within 30 days, so that'll be mid-February, Health and Human Services is to provide clear guidance on expanding on the sex-based definitions set forth in this order. So we're going to start seeing proposed regulations and guidance that further emphasize these specific and extremely narrow, non-scientific definitions. All federal agencies and employees must use the definitions that are in these in this order. Then they must use them for all proposed statutes, regulations, or guidance. They must use them for all agency business, documents, and communications, which has been interpreted to be anybody who has, puts pronouns optionally in their email signature are going to be under attack. Anybody who acknowledges publicly that transgender individuals have rights, they're going to be under attack. Further, it says that the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security and the Director of the Office of Personnel Management, so Secretary of State, Homeland Security, and OPM, shall implement changes to require that government-issued identification documents, including passports, visas, and global entry cards, accurately reflect the holder's sex, as defined under Section 2 of this order. And what that's going to mean is all federally issued documents, so passports, visas, global entry cards, they're only going to be allowed to have M or F, and there's going to be no more X marker. There are anecdotal reports of individuals who have gone in to get their name changed, gone in to get their gender marker changed, that their passports and their supporting documentation are being seized and they're being refused to be returned. This is an extremely concerning area of the law. The allegations are that despite the fact that this is not currently binding, and despite the fact that there are no current regulations, that passport offices, again, are refusing to issue passports, and not only that, but they're seizing existing passports. Lambda Legal is already on the lookout for individuals who are experiencing this, and I would expect there to be legal challenges extremely soon. Additional directives: federal government will not recognize gender separate from sex at birth. That's kind of a no-brainer given the definitions that they've created. They're not going to issue any documents. That's any documents. So if you have a census document, it's going to ask, what's your biological sex at birth? It cannot ask, what is your gender? And you cannot issue any guidance that talks about transgender individuals, that supports transgender individuals in any way. And possibly the most importantly, they're not going to spend any money on funding gender ideology. That's what it says. That's an extremely broad statement. And it basically is the stick that they're going to use on anybody who has any amount of federal funding. They're going to say, if you are pro-trans, you do not get those federal funds. And we might even revoke those federal funds you have. Brienne has a question. Says, are we concerned about those who have already legally changed their name, that they will be forced to use birth name and gender at birth for federal or any job? Yes, actually, we are in fact worried about that. There's going to be a little bit of state by state to that so far, but we are worried that the federal government is not going to recognize any court order that says change my name and change my gender marker. And there's some indication that they're going to try and go back and reverse some of that. Okay. Um, Also, in the Defending Women executive order, they're talking specifically about prisons. So, for the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security, um, they're saying that males are not to be detained in women's facilities. There's no mention of trans men being housed in women's facilities, so this one is very specifically directed at males, which includes, by their definition, transgender women. This is extremely concerning, and because it is going to cause humongous safety issues for those incarcerated individuals. But I will note that this narrow directive has already been halted by at least one federal court, though we don't have any clear indication of how long those injunctions are going to last and whether they're going to be overturned on appeal. So here we've got Seymour going, am I out of touch? No, it's the American Medical Association, Psychiatric Association. Oh, there's typos in this, whatever. Anyway, this is what I get for finding memes on the internet. But they're saying, am I out of touch? No, it's everybody else that's wrong. So that is the official federal government position as of January 20th, is that everyone who's in support of transgender rights is wrong. All right, next one, prioritizing military excellence and readiness. And this one might not seem like it is anti-trans, but from start to finish, that is exactly what it is. The authority here is a lot more nebulous. It's just by the laws vested in me, or authority vested in me by the president, and the laws of the United States of America as commander of chief in chief of the armed forces. That's all it is. So this is where the extreme sort of moral judgments start coming up. Being transgender conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle. It's a man's assertion that he is a woman, and his requirement that others honor this falsehood is not consistent with the humility and selflessness required of a service member. So according to the order, being transgender is not honorable. It's not truthful. It means you cannot be humble or selfless, and it means you cannot achieve high standards like lethality and uniformity. These are absolutely moral judgments by the federal government about people who are transgender. And they're saying, based on those moral judgments, we want the Secretary of Defense to update medical standards to apply these definitions and requirements. Once those are updated, we would expect to see discharges. And on the basis of the fact that they're saying that these are immoral and these are wrong and you cannot uphold the military standards, I would expect these to be somewhere along the lines of dishonorable discharges, which is going to affect a number of individuals in our armed forces. But not just the Army, Navy, Marines, Space Force, et cetera. But the Secretary of Homeland Security is to implement these regulations for the Coast Guard as well. So here we've got Homer. I have to think like a great military leader, and he's thinking of Captain Crunch. So protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. This one is probably the roughest one out of all of them, at least in terms of the impact on a specific population, a small population, and an extremely vulnerable population. Again, there's no specific authority cited. And we look at the purpose and we immediately get a sense of what they're pushing. Across the country today, medical professionals are maiming and sterilizing a growing number of impressionable children under the radical and false claim that adults can change a child's sex through a series of irreversible medical interventions. This dangerous trend will be a stain on our nation's history, and it must end. Accordingly, it is the policy of the United States that it will not fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support the so-called transition of a child from one sex to another, and it will rigorously enforce all laws that prohibit or limit these destructive and life-altering procedures. So it starts immediately with a false claim about doctors maiming children. It refers to sterilization and surgeries and irreversible procedures, and it describes them as destructive and life-altering. But when it goes into the phrase or the definitions, it talks this mutilation, chemical and surgical mutilation, includes the use of puberty blockers, which I just do some research on that. Puberty blockers have been used for decades and are safe and have no long-term permanent effects unless you continue to use them outside of the supervision of a medical professional. The use of sex hormones such as androgen blockers, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone to align your physical appearance with an identity that differs. So that's any kind of medical transitioning, regardless of whether or not there's surgery involved. And then finally, they say surgical procedures that attempt to transform an individual's physical appearance to align with that identity that differs from his or her sex, or that attempt to alter or remove their sexual organs. This phrase is sometimes referred to as gender affirming care. That is not what gender affirming care means. This is a very specific, very limiting definition of the science, and they're trying to make it the legal definition as well. So again, it targets puberty blockers, which are proven safe and effective and are used by cisgender children with precocious puberty, targets hormone replacement, and targets surgical procedures, which are rarely, if ever, performed on minors. I've got the stat at the very end of this presentation, but it is, I think, 2.1 out of every 100,000 minors get some sort of surgery, and of those, they're almost always related to breast reduction. So the directives under this, they're labeling the World Professional Association for Transgender Health Studies and Guidelines as junk science. That's WPATH. That is a massive swath of the science and the guidelines that are designed from the ground up to protect transgender youth. They're labeling it all as junk science. They're rescinding all policies based on WPATH standards of care, which again, those standards of care are designed to protect transgender children. And then within 90 days, the Secretary of Health and Human Services is to publish a review of existing literature. I can guarantee you that review of existing literature will label everything that is pro-trans as bad and everything that details sort of the alleged horrors of youth care as truth and good. And again, it's directing all agencies to end federal programs, grants, et cetera, that fund care for minors. Which, just like we saw with abortion care and Planned Parenthood, it means that clinics are going to shut down. It means that hospitals that receive federal grants are going to stop their care programs. I mean, we saw that in Texas. We've seen that in other states, and it is now the official policy of the United States. Health and Human Services is to amend all documents and programs, including Medicare and Medicaid. So health insurance for the elderly and impoverished. It's going to affect the Affordable Care Act. So anybody who has a policy that they're trying to get from the Affordable Care Act, in theory, that is very soon not going to include any gender-affirming care options. Finally, they do directly call out the DSM, which is it's the manual by which gender dysphoria is defined and all sorts of other things. They're saying, like, to the extent that HHS is involved in that, then the DSM can no longer promote any kind of gender ideology. It does revoke Biden-era guidance on gender-affirming care standards, and interestingly, it specifically says it'll protect whistleblowers who turn in those who provide care, and that's basically following the template of places like Texas, where they have implemented systems of, hey, do you know somebody who's doing this? Well, turn them in and get a $10,000 bounty. It's headed in that direction. Okay. So what they're thinking, or at least what they say that they think, is, there's a bunch of unethical doctors out there who's performing surgeries on children, and that's just simply not the case. But there is a continuing basis in all of these executive orders where they're simply saying, your version of science is not true. We are not going to fund it. We're not going to help you, and go away. Ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schooling. And I realize that we're getting close to the 30-minute mark here, so I'm going to try and speed it up a little bit. Again, no particular authority cited. Says that American schools are deliberately blocking parental oversight, and parents and students are being forced to accept radical ideologies without question or examination. So steering students towards surgical and chemical mutilation without parental consent or involvement. Um, this simply isn't happening. This is a conspiracy theory turned into a direct executive order. It's just not actually happening. There are no schools um, that are trying to push any sort of gender identity thing on students. It's just simply not happening. Um, so they seek to ensure that the any K through 12 program complies with this administration's order and these definitions. And how? Well, they threaten federal funding. They say we're going to pull funding from any school that is allowing transgender students to use the appropriate bathrooms, and they're honoring students' pronouns, or they're requiring their faculty to use a student's preferred name. Any of that could be potentially grounds for revoking federal funding. They're talking about investigating schools, and especially with empowering state agencies to go after specific schools. And this isn't in this direct order, but they are talking about gutting and weakening the U.S. Department of Education, if not eliminating it completely. So it would be returning a lot of those kinds of functions to the states. And in states like Texas, that'll mean no protection for LGBT across the board. So they do add a couple of definitions in here. They talk about social transitioning as opposed to medical transitioning, and they call it the process of adopting a gender identity or marker that differs from a person's sex. So right there, they're attacking preferred names, preferred pronouns, any kind of counseling. They specifically call out counseling, therapeutic, providing of any kind, not just therapeutic, but just school counseling to students. They're calling out locker room and bathroom use. They're calling out athletics and extracurriculars, and it's broad. They're saying within 90 days, try to eliminate federal funding or support for any school or program that provides these kinds of gender-affirming care, not care, but social transitioning support. They are to create an ending indoctrination strategy. That document is going to be horrifying when it comes out. I'm just going to be honest with you. It's going to be absolutely horrifying. And finally, it's going to say enable agencies to revoke funding, which is going to effectively be a system of fast tracking removing federal funds from any school who doesn't comply. So here we got another Simpsons gif. It's just sort of chaos in the schools, and it's going to be, as someone who has represented school districts for a long, long time, schools are going to be hit really hard by this. But more specifically, schools are going to be put between a rock and a hard place because educators want to support their kids. That's just a fact. And they know that this is a vulnerable population, and they're not going to be allowed to help them anymore. Finally, this is the one that launched or landed just a couple of days ago, so we'll give a couple more minutes on this. Keeping men out of women's sports. Again, no specific authority cited. Interestingly, this one does say it's to protect opportunities for women and girls to compete in safe and fair sports. Okay. the purpose, and again, this is a moral judgment. They're saying allowing men to compete in women's sports is demeaning, unfair, and dangerous to women and girls, denying women and girls equal opportunity to participate and excel in competitive sports. It's the policy of the United States to rescind all funds from educational programs that deprive women and girls of fair athletic opportunities, which results in the endangerment, humiliation, and silencing of women and girls and deprives them of privacy. It shall also be the policy of the United States to oppose male competitive participation in women's sports more broadly as a matter of safety, fairness, dignity, and truth. It's not hard to see the moral judgment that's being made here. So in directives, they're calling out have to have single-sex sports. You have to have single-sex locker rooms, changing facilities, etc. You have to have Title IX enforcement actions against K through 12 entities, but also against universities and also against any athletic association that has any sort of federal funding whatsoever. They direct representatives of the federal government to convene with representatives of major athletic organizations and governing bodies. So that's going to be like the NCAA. It is require meetings with state attorneys general to identify best practices. Not entirely clear what that's going to be, but we're going to see some bad stuff come out of that. Withdraw federal support and participation from any sports activity that promotes sort of transgender inclusion. And here's where we start to get to the international aspects of things. They're going to promote international competition rules at the United Nations. I don't know how that's going to look, but that's the official position. They're going to go into immigration policies and basically, if you're a transgender athlete and you are trying to immigrate for your sport, they're saying, nope, not going to let you in. And then finally, they say that they're going to basically put pressure on the International Olympics committees to be fully anti-trans. So the final Simpsons gif here, it's Lisa playing sports with Bart, hockey with Bart. So we have, and Alyssa asks, does this executive order impact trans men or just trans women? The details of it would be, so they call out trans women specifically, but this one is broad enough that it will also affect trans men. They're saying single-sex sports, single-sex locker rooms, universities, etc. And the idea here is going to be that, again, single sex, using that definition from that first executive order, where they're talking specifically about men at birth, female at birth, nothing else matters. So this is a sort of universal affecting directive, even though they call it protecting women's sports. Okay, I'm going to end here with some facts. And when I put the materials up on the website, solizcoleman.com, I'm going to have citations for these. But for now, there's less than 10 transgender athletes out of 530,000 at the NCAA level. So this is a tiny, tiny fraction. Population-wise, less than 1 to 2% of the United States population identify as trans or non-binary. There is a 1% regret rate for gender-affirming surgery, which when you compare that to any other kind of surgery or procedure, LASIK, hip replacements, gallbladder removal, etc., like 1% is insanely low. Again, puberty blockers are tested and commonly used in cisgender children. They are safe, and if the idea was protecting children, they wouldn't also be going after puberty blockers. And then surgeries on minors, again, 2.1 per 100,000, and even those are mostly chest-related surgeries. What they're calling out and what they're trying to stop simply doesn't exist in the United States. So what is the point? Well, it's erasure. It's systemic legal erasure of transgender individuals from the federal level down. And it's not merely from federal recognition, but it tries to erase them in schools. Schools are not going to be allowed to teach about it. They're not going to be allowed to support it. Athletics, we've already seen K through 12, collegiate, and Olympic levels. They're revoking medical coverage. So if you are transgender and if you are currently getting medical coverage, medical care, that's getting taken away. And if you're seeking out medical care, you're not going to be able to find it. They are revoking research opportunities and studies. Anything that is currently investigating or trying to come up with better science that supports the trans community, that's all being revoked as long as there's any federal funding involved. They are revoking grant programs. So any grants to a nonprofit, for example, that supports LGBT community, that's being revoked. Really, it's trying to erase transgender individuals as a whole from public discourse by labeling them all as these dishonest predators, effectively. I put missing persons in there because one of the allegations that I've seen, one of the anecdotes I've seen recently is, for example, the national, I think National Association for Exploited Children and Exploited and Missing Children, I think. I can't remember the acronym right now, but they have been directed by the feds that they are to be removing any reference to transgender or LGBT support from their website, from their materials. And if, for example, a transgender child has gone missing, they're being told allegedly to refer to the student or refer to the individual's dead name, which is the name that they had at birth, as opposed to any preferred name, as opposed to any legally changed name. They're eradicating mental health supports and they're eradicating employment protections across the board. Okay, so that's what I've got for y'all. This is a rapidly developing area of law. You know, like I said, one of these orders came out just 2 days ago, less than 48 hours ago. We're trying to keep on top of it, and we're going to try and continue to provide information and support for anybody we can. So feel free to look out for additional future episodes of Outlaw 101. We are very much going to try and do what we can. And that means educating anybody that we can, and that means helping out individuals. Referrals are highly appreciated, but definitely appreciate you being here today. Does anybody else have any other questions that I can get to before the end? Let me go ahead and stop the share. Okay, I think that'll be it then. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. I appreciate you all, and please have a wonderful day and a great weekend.